there is a great deal of implementation of what happened in Glasgow taking place. Now, is there enough? No. Does there have to be more? Massively. And more and faster. I think that is really the hallmark of what needs to be taking place. But we left Glasgow with 65% of global GDP committed to legitimate plans that, if followed, could keep 1.5 degrees alive. The problem is, if you only have 65% of global GDP doing that, you got a real problem. And the other 35% has to come to the table with significant increases. That's what we called for in Glasgow. We said specifically that there would be a review, that countries that hadn't put in a sufficient NDC need to raise their NDC or submit one. NDC, of course, being your national determined contribution. So, you know, we need to make sure that COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh is the implementation COP, ... plus. Implementation of promises made, which Fatih Birol and the IEA said, if you did all of that, you would, by 2050, be holding the Earth's temperature increase to 1.8 degrees. But the plus is getting these other countries to get a much higher percentage of global GDP committed to the same track. Remains to be seen if we can get there. But you know, China and the United States, the two biggest economies in the world, the two biggest emitters in the world, 40% of all emissions, need to be moving aggressively in the same direction. We now, as you know, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, with the infrastructure legislation, with other measures the president is taking in terms of executive orders and regulatory process, we will be on track to get the full 50 to 52% reduction. And the science says we have to hit a minimum of 45% by 2030. We could still do that, folks. You actually could do that if we deployed renewables fast enough around the world, but we're not. And so the choice here for a lot of countries is not, oh my gosh, all you have to do is just renew. No, that's not fair. People can do nuclear. People could do capturing of emissions. People could do geothermal. I mean, there are a lot of different options here that are not sufficiently tapped into. And that is our challenge right now, is speeding up massively, getting more people included, and setting firmer goals for the people not yet there.
What did the UN report that has just come out on the nationally determined contributions? How did you read that? In a way, it was better than a year ago, but it still showed a formidable gap.
There is a formidable gap. There absolutely is a formidable gap, and obviously, I mean, it'd be, you know, you'd be inappropriate and crazy not to acknowledge that COVID has had an impact. Ukraine has had an impact. And there is a new false narrative being circulated by certain powerful interests that this is the signal, what's happened to the marketplace is a signal that we're moving too fast and that we need to somehow be pumping one thing or another much more. False, false, false. And a repeat of a pattern that has gotten us to where we are to some degree, which is avoidance of reality, downgrading science, unwillingness to be truthful to each other, basing policy partly on the basis of self-delusion. And we have to stop all of that. And I hope Sharm el-Sheikh will be another, pardon the pun, but shaking up of people who need to get more serious about what we need to do. And yet, excuse me, but every single legitimate analysis, economic analysis, tells us it is far more expensive to not proceed at the pace we need to now than it is to proceed at it. And solar and wind, among other things, are definitively, by any legitimate accounting process, cheaper than staying with coal or with fossil fuel. It's just cheaper. And mind you, no one historically has appropriately measured the true cost of the fossil fuel, which after all 90% of all the warming taking place on the planet, which comes principally from unabated emissions, goes into the ocean. And it's warming the ocean with the impact that we have more moisture going up into the atmosphere, dropping in the form of rain. Ask Pakistan what the consequences of that are. Other places in the world where there are floods. We are just, rather, I hate to say it, but I mean, just sort of myopically, stupidly, almost pursuing a kind of ostrich policy. Put your head in the sand and pretend there's nothing happening. But it is happening, inexorably. And it is legitimate to say that if you look out at the world today that we live in, this past year may be the best it's going to be. Think of that.
And this has been, as you said, not just in Pakistan,
this
a year of enormous,
may be the best because everything indicates there will be more damage, worse consequences going forward. That is a very bitter pill to offer our children and future generations. There is a way to change that. And the issue is, will we seize the options available to us, which, by the way, offer the greatest economic opportunity the world has ever known.
I'm going to come on in a second to the question of damage and what might be done about it. But I wanted to ask you about the US and China specifically, because you have said, look, the two countries need to cooperate with each other on this. What are the chances of that at Sharm el-Sheikh?
Well, I mean, I can't give you percentages, but I can tell you that...
I wasn't asking for that, more a diplomat's answer.
Sorry, I learned a few bad habits over the last 5 years.
Which is what, to quantify things that cannot be quantified. I will ask you what movement you thought there might be and what agreement between the two countries.
I think China understands. Look, they chose a particular moment to make a particular point. We have argued adamantly, and I still argue, that this is not a bilateral issue. It's a multilateral global threat to the planet itself, which the two largest economies and the two biggest emitters have a fundamental responsibility to come together and try to address. So I'm hoping, I still genuinely hope, that we will come together in Sharm el-Sheikh, that China and the United States will find the opportunity to do some work together. And I have great respect for my counterpart. He's a longtime friend, 25 years. Someone will probably tweet bad things about me for calling somebody from China a friend, but he is, and I have respect for his knowledge and his ability. He wants to get things done, and the question is, will we be able to, or have time, hopefully, to be able to do that? This is not a bilateral issue. It's a multilateral, non-ideological, non-political issue, and therefore, I believe, needs every voice on the planet to come together to help us find a way forward. And we can't win this battle without, nobody should cut me off at the battle, without the ability to bring these countries together and reduce emissions. No country can do this by itself, number one. Not even can we do it without all of those 20 largest economies in the world joining in, at least the vast majority of them. Right now, we're at 65%. That means 35% is outside of that pathway. If we can bring them on board, that's China, Russia, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and Mexico. If we can bring some of those, and we're working with them, every one of them. We're negotiating with Indonesia right now. We hope to be able to sign a joint just energy transition partnership. We're working with South Africa. We're working with Vietnam. I'm going tomorrow morning early to Mexico to meet with President López Obrador. We hope Mexico will come on board more. UK has been leading our effort with South Africa. We hope that can come together. If we can move those countries, folks, we have a chance in Sharm el-Sheikh to raise ambition well above the 65. I'm not going to prognosticate, a number, but think about how that moves us forward.
You were mentioning just a moment ago damages, some of the damage from climate change. You were talking about Pakistan and the floods there, but there are lots of other examples. And people in those countries might say, look, it's all very well to talk about our children, about future generations, all that is real, but what about the damage caused right now by climate change to countries which they would argue have not been the ones putting the bulk of carbon and other gases in the atmosphere? What is the obligation to help them financially right now with the damage that they say that they are suffering?
Well, we need to help them with a lot of aspects of their challenge right now, including some of the damage, but also the question is how and what is the framework within which that will happen. But let me put an exclamation point on this challenge and then share with you how I think we're beginning to really address it. 17 countries, I mentioned, equal 17 countries in Africa out of 20 of the countries in the world that are most impacted by the climate crisis are, as I said, African. And yet Africa as a whole is only 2.5%, 3% of all the emissions in the world. They're not causing this problem. I was just the other day in Senegal and DRC in Nigeria, where each of the presidents said to me, you know, we're prepared not to dig for gas. We're prepared not to be gas dependent going forward, but tell me how I can provide energy to my people without it. We have it. Do we have your money? Do we have your technology to deploy the renewables and have a better grid and alternative? The answer is no. So we are failing globally to be able to provide countries with the development capacity they want. Now, frankly, that's a development challenge, not just a climate challenge. It's how do we develop the developing world? And we've been falling short of what we should be doing grotesquely with respect to health and community building and energy and a host of different things. So that has to become more real, number one. Number two, we have got to help those countries to be able to jumpstart. When you have only 17% of your population that has electricity, you do not have a sufficient revenue base to support the marketplace becoming involved. So if you're not going to just have the status quo dragging on and creating horrendous north-south tensions and changing this dialogue from one that ought to be constructive as to how we move forward together, we've got to address that. I believe there is a real north-south compelling factor in how we come together. But if it becomes just sort of liability and compensation and reparation or something, that's not going to advance the dialogue. The dialogue has to advance around finding ways to address loss and damage. What will be the legitimate facility or financial arrangements, if you will, not facility, but financial arrangements by which we go forward? Well, we have to put more into adaptation. We have to put more into development. I'm convinced that if there was a more legitimate development process taking place with the multilateral development banks more engaged and putting more money on the table, we'd have less of this, angst and anger.
And it is anger, and it is a morally charged anger saying, look, what about some kind of reparations for the damage suffered? And I was listening carefully as you're answering, and it seemed to me your first answer is, look, we're going to do a lot more about development and helping these countries with development and energy development, and then adaptation, and then you started saying we will have a facility.
We will have a very, I'm sure, deeply engaged. We're already working at it. I mean, we're not sitting around waiting to go to Sharm el-Sheikh to begin the discussion. Our teams have been meeting and working on this very hard. And I think there is a very good meeting of minds beginning to gel as to how we can manage this. And I want to say very directly to the media, don't come to Sharm el-Sheikh looking for a storyline that says loss and damage is somehow ripping this place apart. It's not. It's not going to. We are not sitting on the outside of this dialogue. We are not resisting the notion that we have to deal with it. The dialogue, I mean, there's already agreement about standing up the Santiago network. There's already agreement that we have to be having this discussion with intensity and serious purpose. But there are complicated relationships here. For instance, let me give you an example. Damage has been done over the years historically by a certain group of countries that were engaged in principally coal-fired power production. But mind you, an awful lot of countries have been using coal for 70 or 80 years, not just us. So how do you apportion that? How do you deal with that? What is the appropriate way to begin to build consensus here of how we go forward? And it is a conglomerate effort to provide better development capacity, to provide legitimate help to deal with the loss and damage, to provide legitimate help to deal with the reality today for adaptation and resilience building. We're committed to building out an early warning system that could be in place in the next 5 years. We're committed to building, through the dialogue, understanding of how we can do more faster to deal with damages and disaster. Pakistan, for instance. One of the principal tools available to us that has not been adequately pursued are the MDBs. We just met in Washington a week ago under the auspices of the Bezos Fund and the Rockefeller Foundation, and we had discussions with several of the presidents of the banks and with a bunch of folks who are stakeholders. How do we follow up on Janet Yellen's notion of a new Bretton Woods, and what is the shape it ought to take? We are the largest shareholder in the world. We need to initiate that, I would say, fundamentally, together with France and Germany and Britain and others, and rapidly come up with an understanding of how the capital allocation of those banks could be replenished very significantly without a major change of rules. We believe that could happen by looking at called capital differently and looking at the preferred credit preference, et cetera. We think there are ways to do this, and it could provide hundreds of billions of available additional funding right now for lending. We also could begin to deal differently with debt. Many of these countries are burdened by debt. They are greatly impacted by what happens with respect to the crisis, the climate. And then they turn around and the West or the North offers them more debt. That isn't going to work. And I think we got to find out ways to do either debt forgiveness or debt leverage, or, you know, there are a lot of tools available, and there are a lot of people smarter than I am in finance who could lay out new financial instruments and new ways in which we could behave better. But we have to face up to this, and I'm confident we will. And the storyline should be how we're addressing it, not whether we'll address it.
All right, thank you. Really interesting points there. Let's take a step, not quite sideways, but one of the big things that's happened in the past year is Ukraine. Obviously, a catastrophe for the people of Ukraine, for the rules-based international order, for all kinds of other things, has driven up energy prices very dramatically. Has this been, I'm reaching for a silver lining, I guess, of the kind that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, sketched out in its recent report? Is it accelerating, do you think, a move away from some kinds of energy?
Absolutely, without question.
How much?
Well, Germany has made the decision that it will be deploying 80% of its energy is going to come from renewables. And they've made a very radical break with dependency on Russian gas. And I think with such a determination based on the horror of what is happening in Ukraine and based on the stark realization of what this dependency has done to their own economy and their own future. So I see this replicating itself in many places around the world. The obvious response to what has happened when a dictator can weaponize your energy is to get out of that situation, take the bullets away. And that's exactly what I think is happening.
Which can produce a drive towards renewables, but it can, as we saw with the last brief UK government, produce an impulse towards fracking, for example.
Well,
it
provides
a drive towards energy security of any type.
I understand that's already been reversed.
I believe so. In the
let's have some other possibilities on that score.
But the point being, the countries reach for energy security wherever they can get it, and suddenly that begins to trump some of the
we could get
renewable
it. We will get
environment
energy security. Don't overblow this energy security challenge. Is it real? Yes, it's real. Every country faces choices with respect to how they will provide energy security to their citizens. But I think we have the options on the table, and we have some of them available to us immediately, which can get us down the road enough that other technologies will come online. Let me be specific. The IEA tells us, and I think the IEA, by the way, has become a terrific referee, if you will, between countries and hemispheres on the issue of what are the facts and what's viable. One of the things we must do here, I said this at the Council on Foreign Relations the other day, is our decisions must be based on truth and on science, not on, you know, these slogans and false assumptions about, you know, sort of self-delusion about what's going to work here. We have a fixed set of choices available to us now, which could get us well down the road to this transformation. Just doing more geothermal, folks. Geothermal is an underappreciated source of remarkable energy. We now have drilling capacity, I might add, coming out of the drilling we've done for years in fossil fuels, but we know how to drill down for heat and to take extraordinary levels of heat and put it to use, to drive turbines, to produce electricity that's clean. We can get higher levels of degrees of heat than we ever imagined, which can help us with certain industrial processes, et cetera. You look at Iceland, Iceland is 100% renewables and 90-something% geothermal. So we know how to do it. And we can, it's increasingly, China is doing more of this, other countries are looking at it. So we also, you know, some people recoil when you say this. I don't see how we get to the achievement of our goals without some component of nuclear personally. It's just a personal opinion. President Biden shares that. Our policy in our country is that. Our national laboratory in Idaho is building a new generation, a large-scale nuclear plant.
Do you mean specifically about the US getting to its commitments, or
no, I think
many
globally,
countries? Yeah.
Globally, the entire planet. I don't know how we get there. I mean, look at France. 70% of its energy comes from nuclear and has for years now. And I think if you look at other countries, you have 4 or 5 major producers of nuclear: Russia, Korea, China, the US, France. And, you know, I think that they all have developed technology and have great means of doing it. They'll compete in the marketplace for that ability. But I think beyond that, there's much, much, much more we can do with renewables. If fusion breaks through, I mean, you read the latest reports out of Commonwealth Fusion at MIT, you look at what other countries are doing. Britain is pursuing this, other countries. I went out to California to go to Google and to our national lab, and then to meet with startups. And as I listened to the scientists that I listened to for 28 years in the Senate, when they always told me, well, fusion is 30 years down the road, and then 10 years later it'd be 30 years down the road, you don't hear that now. Now there have been some breakthroughs that are proof of concept that have drawn private capital to the table. And there is a collaboration between companies looking at how to do this that will accelerate even more the possibilities. So by 2025, I think Commonwealth Fusion is hoping to have a demonstration reactor that has the ability to put greater proof of concept on the table. Now, will that work? I don't know. But I know that there are a lot of things that are happening, and I've seen startups that blow my mind for the possibilities of what they're going to be able to do to change the dynamics, whether it's water storage or longer battery storage, better balancing of grids, artificial intelligence in the grid process, how we send energy from one place to another, how we produce that energy, how much energy we can produce that way. I mean, windmills, you know, large turbines now are capable of, what, 15 plus megawatts? That's a whole different world. And you start putting out 15 megawatts here, and you know, suddenly you're at, you know, 500 megawatts, half a gigawatt. I mean, you're going to see changes, I think, that are dramatic. So that's
I'm interested in the way you interpret the role of being envoy. Do you feel you have license, for example, to say to Germany or Japan, how about thinking again about nuclear? I'm not so sure your energy plans are going to work out. Or do you see yourself as an advocate around the world for, just as you have been right now, for countries embracing things that they may not quite have
Well,
granted?
I think in the time of crisis, you have to be more willing to look at things that you might have been more questionable about. 30 years ago, when I was a young senator, I was totally opposed to nuclear, and I was very much at the forefront of, better and longer or lasting restraints on nuclear weaponry. And I regret where we have come to be in that, pulling out of the ABM treaty, all the things that have happened, wrong direction. But maybe I've taken some license, which is the prerogative of somebody who ran for president, lost, marginally.
I wasn't going to ask you about 2004, and they.
But I think that all discussion is on the table. Now, I can't fulfill my obligation to do this role properly as President Biden has defined it and wants me to, without pushing the limits here a little bit, and we have to do that. We're obviously not getting the job done yet. We're not moving fast enough. We're not moving big enough. And we have to overcome this not new cultural and human frailty, where we don't decide to do things that are obvious that we have to do. And there's something in the human psyche that has an ability to procrastinate and to avoid and to, we all know this. We just can't afford to do that on this one. So we have to bang our heads against, the table and the wall and find a way to accelerate what we're doing. It's incomprehensible to me that we're sort of on a pathway that is as dangerous as this pathway is. Everything that's happening today is happening at 1.1 degrees of warming. Our limit we're trying to keep is at 1.5. At this stage, before we've even exhausted the 7 years left to 2030, are we going to give up and say we can't make it? I just am unwilling to do that.
And so I wanted to ask you, just before we come to the wider questions, do you think 1.5% is still within reach?
Only if we implement with every promise made in Glasgow and the promises we have to make still in Sharm el-Sheikh and in UAE, and implementation we have to engage in. We're not implementing enough. I mean, I was with some MPs today down at Westminster, and they sat there and said, we have great goals. We're 68% and then 75%, but we're not implementing. That's their comment to me. And so we all need to implement when we consider that the consequences of not doing that are as grave as they are. And look at where we are. I mean, this year in the Arctic, it was 70 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. In the Antarctic, it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. We saw a large sector of the Larsen ice sheet in the West Antarctic break off. Went out and melted. We have a rate of melt that is telling us we're now looking at meters of increase, maybe 2 or so in this century. That was not the prediction of scientists 5 years ago. What they're saying now was going to happen at the end of the century, they're saying now is going to happen in 30 years. So we keep courting this disaster. And I refuse, and I think most rational people want to refuse to accept that as our fate. I don't think it is. We can't sleepwalk over this cliff in some sort of mutual suicide pact. We have to respond. And people all over the world are demanding that we do that. What's so damning about this is it's really good economics to respond. It is the greatest economic opportunity we've had since the Industrial Revolution. This is a second Industrial Revolution, and only a clean one that takes us to a healthier, cleaner, safer community, state, planet in which we live. And I think it's still urgent that we keep pushing to get there.
Thank you. Let's go to questions. There are going to be a lot, and I've got some terrific ones online as well. I'm going to take a couple at a time. I have a marvelous array. All right, I'm going to start here because I think you were first, and I'm going to take two at once. And please do say your name.
Chris McElhaney. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I'm from 25 miles west of Glasgow, so unfortunately I never got to see you last year because I couldn't get a ticket, so it's great to get along today.
I worked out interpreting you guys over the 6 years.
You can translate for everyone else.
But now I got to get my...
So just on that point of Scotland, so we don't really experience, extreme climate change, but we're actually one of the world's leaders in terms of our drive towards renewables. But that's perhaps easy because of our abundance of water. For hydro, we have 25% of Europe's offshore wind potential, and we have massive onshore wind potential. So I guess it's...
Will you forgive me?
Yes, I'll be succinct, Jim. So it's quite easy for us to, move into renewables, whereas you were talking about Africa, etc. It's difficult. So I was just wondering, do you not think that a state like Scotland, two words you used were demonstration and abatement, we should have more of a drive to be a demonstrator nation, showing people how you carbon capture, developing cheaper technology on wind hydro so we can then export it to countries like Africa. And how do you think, no country really wants to apportion most of its resources towards renewables. How do you think you create a state that actually says, no, we need to do this because this should be the next big export wave?
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to take the woman second from the aisle.
Thank you very much, Special Envoy Kerry. My name is Belinda Sherpa. I'm with climate think tank E3G. I have three short questions.
No, I'm really sorry.
Okay,
I'm really sorry.
I'll have one then.
Pick your best one. But
on your point on China, given that China has suspended the bilateral talks and given the increased geopolitical tensions, are you considering other ways of influencing China's calculus on climate change beyond bilateral cooperation, such as increasing the US's own climate action, such as through the IRA and other bits, but also by perhaps stepping up your NDC at the upcoming COP, and by increasing relations with countries in the Global South and stepping up financial commitments, such as to the Global Shield? Thank you.
No, thanks very much. People have got long, intricate points, which are terrific. But okay, China and Scotland. On
Scotland, your question almost answers itself. To be honest with you, of course, hydro. Now you got to choose. You got to be careful. I mean, given the changes that are taking place and the warming, you got to make some real analyses as to whether that hydro is going to be there in 10, 20, 30 years. But if you've got sourcing and capacity to really make that work, absolutely go for it. And we're going to wind up pumping water to places without any doubt in my mind. I mean, I look at the United States and we see what's happening with respect to New Mexico, Colorado, California, Arizona. It's always had a water challenge. Now it's, super. So we're going to have to find ways to deal with that all around the world. And I'm confident we will. I don't think that's not as complex in many ways. We'll also have probably massive desalinization in various places, miniature nuclear batteries, so to speak, and other options are available as to how you power that. And so there'll be, significant. But there's going to be, I think there was many books written about water and conflict and the potential for conflict. We really need to be forward-leaning and prescient about beating, the point where people are fighting over. They already fight about water in various parts of the world. We got to prevent that from becoming a wholesale new security challenge on a global basis. So in China, look, I'm genuinely hopeful that Xi Jinping and I will be able to get together when we get to Glasgow. I don't know, get to Sharm el-Sheikh. And, but we can't just rely on that. We obviously have to find other ways of dealing. If we can't get together with China, and if we don't reach a meeting of the minds as to how we do the two things, we agreed to do three things in Glasgow with China. One, that they will come up with an ambitious methane action plan for this year that they will release at the COP. And we hope to see that and be able to work on it with them, actually, which is what we'd wanted to do in these prior months. We also agreed to accelerate their transition out of coal to the degree that we can, and ours, to work together. Now, our plan is to be coal-free basically by 2030 and to be carbon-free in our power sector by 2035, and I believe we'll get there. But if we can't get agreement, then what the EU has been talking about with respect to a countervailing border adjustment of some kind, I don't think our companies or yours are going to want to sit there for the next 10 years paying for the cost of reducing and making that transition and producing products that reflect the increased price of those products because of it, where there is an increased price, while other countries are just producing dirty and trying to sell to the marketplace. So I think you will see an adjustment there unless people step up and join together. But right now, those alternatives are, as I said earlier today, folks, far cheaper. I mean, I did not complete the thought with respect to the adequacy of how you price coal, but look at the cost of black lung around the world. Look at the cost of air pollution around the world. We lose 15 million people a year to the quality of air on this planet. That's pollution, and much of that pollution is called greenhouse gases. So we need to get serious about the real costs of the particulates we put into the atmosphere. And if we reflected that cost, even though solar and wind beat fossil fuel, hands down, without putting that in, you put that in, and it's just off the charts. So if you're involved in actuarial judgments and you're involved in accountability and transparency in the marketplace, increasingly, I believe, corporations will be called on to look down the road to their supply chains and to their distributed chains as to what sort of costs are really included in their cost of products.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to come in a moment to online ones, but here in the corner and then straight behind you.
Thank you. Hi, Victoria Seabrook from Sky News. We've seen some rowing back on environmental protections in the UK. Alok Sharma has lost his cabinet position. How concerned are you that the UK is ditching its climate leadership role? Thank you.
Well, I can't, there's no way me fairly to measure that in the sense that you've just had a government for what, 1 day, 2 days?
The jokes are too easy, but yeah.
So I've had the pleasure of meeting Rishi, and I respect his basic approach and his intelligence, and I think you know, the confidence of the country rides with him now. Let's see where it goes.
Thank you. Straight behind.
I'm Dr. Isiaku Shitu Al-Mustafa from University of Plymouth, an independent port management consultant. Thank you for your leadership, Senator John Kerry. My question is very simple. You've analyzed key issues. Within African perspective, Africa emits just tiny portion of GAG, global emission. But the issue is this: Nigeria, Mozambique, Tanzania have huge gas resources. What are the specific framework the US and the world superpowers are doing to ensure these gas reserves, which is the next energy transition globally, friendlier, cleaner than crude oil? That is one option. Second question, what do you think of carbon pricing?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, you want me? Let me
No,
just do it quickly.
I'll answer those ones.
On a personal level, I say this because it was a matter of record before I took the job on, and I have favored carbon pricing for some period of time. It's not yet, you know, it's not the policy of the United States yet, and you know, the president has been very clear that he wanted to pursue other ways of trying to see if we can move forward. And we'll see where we wind up on that as we go forward. So, but on the gas issue, I don't, you know, I don't want any of this to get misinterpreted in terms of the gas issue, because gas is going to be part of the transition. It is right now. It's already there. And because of what Russia has done, cutting it off to Europe, we are, US and others, trying to provide and make up for that loss of gas. But over the long haul, gas is also obviously a fossil fuel. It does have CO2 emissions and methane. And methane is the most damaging gas of all. It's 20 to 80 times more destructive than CO2. And we've seen large emissions of methane as a consequence of the breach in the Baltic Sea, and also leaks that are taking place around the world. So methane is very much on the map now. It wasn't on the map when we were in Paris that much. It began to be obviously at Glasgow, and now, you know, to a super degree, it's not a stepchild of this process any longer. Gas, if you're replacing coal or you're replacing oil, is a 30 to 50% immediate reduction. So can you get reductions between now and 2030 if you were to put some gas on the line? Yes. But after you get to 2030, if you're going to continue on the track to net zero by 2050, you're going to have to also be able to capture the emissions of that gas. And so there will be a premium on capture and storage and utilization. But unless we get that, folks, you can't be, this is part of the self-delusion factor I mentioned. You can't pretend that building out a 30 to 40 year infrastructure to have a major gas facility is somehow going to be okay unless you can capture the emissions. And that's going to be a critical measure of these next few years. Does it remain a possible alternative if you can capture the emissions? For sure, absolutely. But that's got to be cost competitive with the other forms of energy that are going to begin lowering costs, like green hydrogen and other things. You know, that's something I can't sit here. We're not going to work that out today. But you've got to recognize and enter into your policy decision the reality of the danger of 30 and 40 year infrastructure that gets built that will be stranded assets under most judgments. And I think that that there are other ways to provide some of that energy in the meantime. But you know, it will be part of this transition for sure, if managed correctly and effectively.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. Right, on the aisle, about 2/3 of the way back. Sorry, further back behind you. Yes, I'm trying to give some justice to people who are very, very quick.
John Warren, physician. Thank you. In COP26, electric cars were in, increased GDP. Anybody who cycles and walks is out, it decreases GDP. Are you open to any solutions to climate that do not increase consumption, do not increase GDP?
Thank you. And here at the front, please.
Thank you. Fahani Amin. When would be a good time for richer countries to apologise for their lack of compliance over the last 3 decades? Is it Sharm el-Sheikh, or is it another COP, or is it another place?
Thank you.
To apologize for what?
For their lack of compliance, the lack of implementation. Yeah.
Well, I am supportive, we are supportive, President Biden is supportive of anything that will produce sustainability and which is adopted by a country and that can be implemented and put in place. We support nature-based solutions. We started this last year, we created the most significant broad-based joint effort with Brazil, which includes all of our key agencies in the US government, the EPA, Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, because there's criminal activity involved in the logging and the destruction of these forests. So we've been looking really hard at what we could do to change the equation with Brazil. And likewise with DRC. We're talking with DRC about how to proceed forward. But yeah, sustainability, I don't know a nation in the world, regrettably, that's living sustainably, and nor are most human beings. We've destroyed 50% of the species on the planet. That continues, and we have a tall order to shift into a sustainable structure. I really think, obviously, with the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN and other countries, and with ESG, which is now in every boardroom of the world, hopefully we may be able to turn a corner. But we're not there yet, and for this lady who asked a particularly pregnant question, every day people, but rather than apologizing every day, the best thing you could do to apologize is get about the business of getting it done. Implement, make it happen. And we owe that to all of us, our citizens, today, tomorrow. But, you know, I wouldn't hope, you know, there are some countries which still, I mean, if you want to look at Russia, folks, in terms of what's happening, not just in Ukraine, but their extractive activities are one of the most destructive on the planet right now. And because of their permafrost thawing, their extractive facilities are undergoing instability with respect to the land mass now, which is shifting because of the thawing and the emissions that are coming out and so forth. So there are just really big dangers out there that are going to require a remarkable level of cooperation. And frankly, it really needs to be almost at a war, like you've really declared you're at war and you're going to win. And you organize everything to be working in that same direction, and we have not yet organized ourselves appropriately. Paul Kennedy has a book out called The Engineers of Victory. And he writes about how in World War II, key decisions were made and implemented with respect to how you win. Gaining control of the skies, gaining control of the ocean, knowing how you were going to penetrate the defenses that Hitler had built up and down the coastline. Those and other decisions had to be made. They were made at mid-levels because people were empowered and given the ability because you had to win. I think we need that same purpose here, if you will, and same sort of coordination.
We already have a war on with Russia, which doesn't make it easier. That's not a flip point. I'm going to, there's a forest of hands up. I'm going to take two specifically about helping Africa in this from online, and thank you for sending them. One from Salah Kamil Salah saying, an honor to have this discussion. Is the USA, public and private sectors, pulling its weight in the renewables field? If not, why? China and India have a big renewables footprint in Africa, offering cheaper technology, more effective deployable research and development. What about the US? And the other one from Temitope Akintunde, saying that this is the view of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce in Nigeria, and saying there is not as much awareness about climate change here. There is a need for government-to-government collaboration on the issue of climate change. What is your perspective? What are you going to contribute on that?
On government collaboration?
Yes.
Government to government.
Government to government.
Well, I'm here. I mean, we're working at this constantly. I was with Ed Miliband, a bunch of members of parliament today, and our government is talking about it. We have a team over here, by the way, now from National Security Council who are working together with the new government, and we're going to work at it. We're open to any collaboration globally, which brings me to the question about China. We used to be a producer of renewable energy, producer in the sense of building solar panels and wind energy. And China, as you all know, years ago came into the WTO, and this is one of the other areas where we have disagreements. We have big disagreements with China about their practices with respect to the marketplace. And the fact is, as you all know, even Germany was a huge investor and purveyor of solar energy. And then, of course, dumping took place. Massive amounts of underpriced goods came in, and the market shifted to where it is today. 95% of all solar panels come out of China, or 70% of all panels, and 95% come out with some wafer or ingot, whatever involved, that links it to Xinjiang and the possibilities of slave labor producing some of those goods. And so you all know that people have taken a moral position with respect to that. The Chinese have reached out to me about whether or not some of the panels are being held up inappropriately, and we'll look at that because we need to know. But that's where you know, global practices are somewhat more complicated. The fact is that we have a big difference with China over its practices regarding intellectual property and the protections that should be afforded intellectual property and access to the marketplace on a fair basis and other kinds of questions. So those issues have got to be worked out, and we've got to engage with China on those issues, and we have to separate climate from those issues. But on occasion, sometimes it sort of commingles, as it does on this issue of the panels coming in and whether we're going to have a fair opportunity for other supply chains. Now, I see other countries now really bending over backwards to develop those other supply chains. And I think the market will even out over a period of time here to some degree, and part of it will come from that enforcement. But we're prepared to work with a lot of countries to make sure that the marketplace rules are applied in a way that's fair, and that we develop multiple supply chains, and there's no cornering of the market in ways that do injury to the whole notion of fair trade and you know, and cooperation.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, over here on the aisle.
Thank you. Secretary Kerry, I'm David Pollock, a supporter of Chatham House. I'd like to ask you about the efforts to mobilize climate finance for the Global South from private institutional capital. They obviously have said very publicly, like the Net Zero Asset Owners Association, they need concessionary capital to come from other sources. You've recognized that. The MDBs are only part of the picture. DFIs, by and large, aren't providing concessionary capital. So what efforts are being made, you know, between governments and with the national DFIs to get them to do their part? Because we need them to get it to mobilize capital at scale from the private sector.
Thank you very much. And here in the front, Bernice.
Hi, Bernice Lee from Chatham House. I mean, the dramatic cost reduction you talked about earlier was a result of a more open, globalized economy, and the world has changed. So I just wonder, in that context, what is your worst and best case scenario for COP27?
Oh. Concessionary capital, and best and worst.
I think the biggest problem that I've seen as I travel to these countries and we try to cope with the need to accelerate this transformation, this transition, the single biggest problem is lack of funds, not lack of technological capacity, even though we have 44 or so technologies that need to be brought to scale faster. But we still have a basic grouping that could allow us to transform much more rapidly. The restraint is that when I sit with one of these presidents, and in the case of these particular three, they're all they say, they have said, I can't do this without some money. And as we have dealt with GFANs and the banks and the large financial institutions over the last years, bringing them to the table, they are ready to deploy trillions of dollars, but as an investment, which means you're going to try to make money. They need bankable deals. And the question for us is, how do you make bankable deals? How do you create bankable deals? Well, that's a mosaic of things that need to change. In some cases, it's transparency in a country, or contract rules, laws, arbitration. How are the downsides going to play out? Because most businesses want to know how they protect their investment. And we don't have the concessionary funding, which implies we're going to go in ready to lose money, or we're going to go in with philanthropic money, which is a grant anyway, and you're giving it to create the concessionary status. We have to formalize that much more effectively, which is what we're working on right now. Now, I believe, and the MDBs are a part of it, but only a part of it, but they can put many more concessionary dollars on the table, no question about it. And you can create blended finance structures where you have some philanthropy here, you have some state money, public money, you have some maybe sovereign immunity that you're willing to grant, you may have some local guarantees that you grant. I mean, there are ways to construct, but it all takes time, folks. We've got to move faster in certain ways. So one of the things we're looking at is the possibility of the private sector, in effect, being enticed to the table, because you have a way of them getting something they need and want, which might be a credit towards their goal, and you get cash that goes directly into closing down some coal plants and deploying renewables, which is direct emissions reduction. So there's nothing phony about it if you can create that construct correctly. So we're working on that. And I hope perhaps even by Sharm el-Sheikh, we might be in a position to outline that together with the MDB reform. Boy, we could put some money on the table. And if you can get concessionary funding, you get $10 billion of concessionary money, you've actually got about $100 billion using leverage and accelerating the process. So I think we're not yet proficient enough in applying some of the tools of the trade that could really open this up. And that's where I think there's as much opportunity in the private sector, frankly, as anywhere else to try to make this transition happen faster.
I'm going to take one more from the audience.
Wasn't there another?
Best and worst from Sharm. Yes.
Well, I'm an optimist. I'm not going to deal with worsts.
Okay, great.
But I will deal with best. I think the best is that we see a significant effort to implement what was promised at in Glasgow, but that you also have a large grouping, a certain size grouping of those countries that were outside of the Glasgow Promise who are coming on board with either a JETP or their own plan for how they're going to deploy. India, for instance, has made a commitment to deploy 500 gigawatts of clean energy. Now, they're pushing to do that. And if they can do that in the next 8 years, and we're going to work as hard as we can, or as they will let us with them, to be able to help that happen, if they did that, India is in compliance with 1.5 degrees, folks. What a message to the developing world of possibilities. So that's worth fighting for, and that's one of the things we're trying to do. If that can get locked down a little better in Sharm el-Sheikh, together with, let's say, Mexico or Indonesia doing some big things, then I think we're starting to show people how this template can work and finance transition.
I've made an unbreakable promise to Secretary Kerry that we are going to end at 4, which is now. I am so sorry, there's a forest of hands up here. There are terrific questions online, including huge ones. Satish Nair, thank you for the one about keeping population levels down, one from Toby Aykroyd, beautifully phrased about bioenergy in Europe and the emissions attached to that. But we can't get to any of these, even you on the aisle who've been so patient. So thank you all for your questions. Thank you for coming. And can you join me in thanking John Kerry?